Hello, we meet again. Still German POWs in America. Today's story doesn't take place on a battlefield. There are no explosions, no gunfire, no lines on a map moving forward or back. It happens before sunrise, in Minnesota, at Camp Ripley, in early 1944. The temperature that morning sat at minus 29 degrees Celsius, minus 20 Fahrenheit. That number doesn't need explanation. Anyone who has felt it knows. Anyone who hasn't can imagine how quickly breath turns sharp, how skin begins to feel distant, like it belongs to someone else. The camp was quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet in the way cold forces silence. Words feel unnecessary when air itself hurts to breathe. The barracks stood dark and still. Snow pressed against the wood, driven sideways by wind that didn't seem to care about fences or rules. The ground was hard, frozen solid. Every step outside sounded louder than it should have. No one spoke, not because they were ordered not to, because the cold took priority. The women stood in line outside, coats pulled tight where they could manage it. Some had scarves, some didn't. Some had learned to sleep in their coats, knowing mornings came too early and warmth took too long. The breath rose in uneven clouds, some short, some shallow, everyone trying not to waste heat. This was not a dramatic moment. No one sensed that anything important was about to happen. It looked like any other morning at a POW camp in winter. Routine, uncomfortable, ordinary. And that's why it mattered. Let me ask you something. At this temperature, what do you think matters more? Rules or instincts? At minus 29, the body stops negotiating. Fingers don't work the way you ask them to. Buttons become problems. Small tasks turn into quiet emergencies. The women had learned this quickly after arriving. Cold changed everything. It shortened patience. It simplified thought. You didn't think about the war.
You didn't think about politics. You thought about keeping your hands moving, keeping your feet planted, not falling. Somewhere nearby, an American guard shifted his weight, hands in his coat pockets, shoulders hunched, not in aggression but against the wind. The guards at Camp Ripley didn't carry themselves like men on a front line. They didn't shout to be heard. They didn't need to. The camp had rules, clear ones, distance, procedure, order. And yet, mornings like this tested those rules, because the cold didn't care who was a prisoner and who wasn't. Snow slipped through gaps in coats, down collars, into places fingers could no longer reach. A button left undone wasn't a small mistake. It was an invitation for the wind to take something it wouldn't give back easily. The women stood still, waiting for the next instruction, waiting for the day to begin. The sky was just starting to change, not light yet, just less dark.
That thin blue-gray that comes before the sun commits. No one looked at the thermometer anymore. They already knew what it would say. This story isn't about heroism. It isn't about mercy handed down from above. It isn't about grand gestures. It's about a moment so small that most people standing there didn't even register it. And that's important, because history often survives in those moments. Not the ones written down, the ones felt, and then carried quietly. You see, when we talk about German POWs in America, the conversation usually drifts toward policy. Geneva Conventions, rations, labor details, comparisons. Those things matter, but they don't explain what it felt like to stand in the dark at minus 29, wondering how much of yourself the cold would take before the day was over. They don't explain how fear works when you can't move fast enough to respond to it, or how misunderstanding can arrive without warning, just as suddenly as kindness.
And they don't explain how a single step forward, not planned, not announced, can change the way a person remembers a place forever.
Do you believe that misunderstandings are more dangerous in silence? When no one explains and no one asks? That morning at Camp Ripley, silence was everywhere. Between breaths, between footsteps, between people standing just far enough apart to avoid touching. It was the kind of morning where nothing was supposed to happen, where routine ruled, where everyone simply waited for time to move. But time didn't move the way it was expected to. Because that morning, one small movement would be misunderstood before it was understood, and it would begin with nothing more than a step out of line. The women were lined up outside the barracks, silent, breath turning white instantly. No one shifted unless they had to. Movement wasted heat. Standing still hurt, but it hurt less than fumbling. The wind came in short bursts, then long ones.
It found every gap, every weak place in wool and cotton. One of the women stood with her coat open. Not wide open, just enough. The fabric had pulled apart sometime during the night. Maybe when she stood up too quickly. Maybe when she'd rolled over on the narrow bunk and the button had slipped free. She hadn't felt it. Her hands were already numb, not painful anymore, past that stage. They felt thick, unreliable, as if they belonged to someone else. She looked down and tried to bring the two sides of the coat together. Her fingers didn't cooperate. The button was small, metal, cold enough to burn. She pressed her thumb against it. Nothing happened. The wind pushed in hard through the opening, straight to her chest. It stole breath she hadn't finished breathing yet. She tried again. This time she missed the buttonhole entirely. No sound came out of her mouth. Not because she didn't want to speak, because air wouldn't move the way it should.
Around her, the line stayed still. No one looked, or if they did, they didn't turn their heads. Everyone had learned the same lesson by now. Focus inward. Keep what heat you have. A few steps away, an American guard stood near the end of the line. He hadn't been watching her, not at first. He'd been watching the sky. That faint change from black to gray, the kind of morning that made you count minutes without knowing why. Then he noticed movement. Not much, just the slight, uneven motion of someone struggling with something small, a coat that wouldn't close. He looked at her hands, then at the open seam of fabric, then back at her face. She didn't look up. Her chin was tucked down, shoulders drawn in, the posture of someone bracing. The guard hesitated. Not long, just enough to be noticeable if you were watching closely. He stepped out of his position. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden rush, just one step forward, then another. Books crunching softly on packed snow. That sound carried more than it should have. In the quiet, everything did. The women near the front heard it first, then the ones beside her. She heard it too. Footsteps, close, too close. Her body reacted before her thoughts did. She froze. Not because of the cold, because of the distance closing behind her. No order had been given, no warning, no voice. The American guard was suddenly in front of her, close enough that she could see the frost forming along the edge of his coat collar, close enough to smell the wool and the cold metal beneath it. He didn't speak. He didn't gesture. He bent down. That was the moment everything changed. Her shoulders locked, her knees stiffened, the world narrowed to the space between them. Back home, a man bending like that close, meant something, especially when you were standing still. Especially when you couldn't step back without drawing attention. She felt the line behind her, the people beside her, the weight of being seen. Her hands stopped trying to work the button. They hung uselessly at her sides. She didn't look up. She couldn't. The cold was still there, biting through the open coat, but it had slipped to the background. Something else had taken its place. Fear doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes as a tightening, a certainty that something is about to go wrong. She thought of rules, then realized rules wouldn't help her here. This wasn't about orders or regulations or lists pinned to walls inside warm offices. This was about proximity and power and the fact that she couldn't move fast enough to change anything. Why would a guard step that close without saying a word? The question formed without language. It sat heavy in her chest. She waited for his hands. They didn't come. Not yet. He reached toward her coat. Her breath caught halfway in. The line around them stayed still. No one intervened. No one spoke. The guard's movement was careful, measured, but she couldn't read intention from movement alone. Not anymore. The wind surged again, hard and sudden, pushing snow into the space between them. It rattled the open fabric of her coat. She felt it slice across skin already numb. Still, she didn't move, because moving now would mean acknowledging the moment, and she didn't know what acknowledgement would bring. The guard lowered himself slightly, bringing his hands level with the open seam of the coat. Close enough now that she could see his breath, thick and steady. Still no words. Her body held tight, waiting for something she didn't want to arrive. This was how shock worked. Not loud, not cinematic, just the absence of options. Time stretched. Or maybe it didn't. Later, she wouldn't be sure. All she knew was that everything inside her had gone still. She didn't move, not because of the cold. Her body locked. The distance was wrong. Too close, too sudden. The moment stretched, thin and fragile, pulled tight between what had just happened and what might come next. She was aware of everything at once: the sound of the wind, the weight of the coat hanging open, the presence of people on all sides of her, and the fact that she could not step back. Behind her, the line of women stood shoulder to shoulder, close enough that she could feel the heat, what little there was, of another body through layers of fabric. To move backward would mean bumping into someone, breaking formation, drawing attention. In front of her stood the American guard, close enough that his boots were almost touching hers. The crowd was no longer invisible. She felt their eyes without seeing them, not staring, not openly watching, but aware. The way people become aware when something unexpected interrupts routine. This was not part of the morning. This was not how things were supposed to happen. Her first instinct was to speak, to say something, anything. But no sound came. Her throat felt tight, as if the cold had climbed upward and lodged itself there. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. She swallowed. Nothing changed. The body often knows before the mind does, before words catch up, before logic has a chance to intervene. Her shoulders stayed rigid. Her arms remained stiff at her sides. Every muscle seems to agree on one thing: do not move. She remembered other lines, other mornings, other places where people were made to stand still while others walked freely in front of them. The memory didn't arrive as a clear picture. It came as a feeling, the kind that presses down on the chest and makes breathing feel optional. She was no longer fully aware of the cold. It hadn't disappeared. It simply stopped being the worst thing happening to her. Fear rearranges priorities quickly. The guard still hadn't spoken. Silence filled the space between them, thick and uncertain. She didn't know where to look. If she raised her eyes, she risked meeting his. If she looked away, she risked appearing weak. If she moved her head at all, she risked drawing attention. So she kept her gaze low, fixed on the ground just beyond his boots. Snow had collected there in uneven ridges, shaped by footsteps and wind. She focused on the shapes, counting them without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. Anything to avoid thinking about how close he was. The line around them felt suddenly exposed, public. This wasn't a private moment. There was no corner to retreat into, no space to disappear. What frightened her wasn't pain. Pain was familiar. Cold taught pain quickly and without apology. What frightened her was the loss of control. The idea that something could happen in front of others, something she could not stop, something that would mark her, even if it left no visible trace. Humiliation lingers longer than bruises. It stays. She felt her face grow warm despite the temperature, a flush she couldn't hide. The guard shifted his weight slightly. The movement was small, but it was enough. Her breath caught again, sharper this time. Her mind raced ahead of her body, filling in possibilities she didn't want to consider.
She thought of how quickly situations could be redefined by a single step, a single touch. She thought of how easily intentions could be misunderstood or ignored. Around them, no one intervened. Not the guards, not the women beside her. Everyone was waiting. Waiting was the worst part, because waiting meant acknowledging that whatever happened next would simply happen. You understand what she feared, right? Not violence, but humiliation. The kind that doesn't require force, only proximity, only silence. The kind that leaves no evidence except memory.
The guard's hands moved again, slowly, deliberately. She felt the air shift as he leaned closer, blocking part of the wind. Her body reacted instantly. Her spine stiffened further, her jaw clenched. This was it, she thought. This was the moment where something irreversible would begin. She had no plan, no response ready. She could not push him away without causing a scene. She could not step aside without breaking the line. She could not even raise her hands properly. They still felt thick, clumsy, useless. The imbalance was complete. He could move. She could not. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply stands where you cannot. The women beside her kept their eyes forward. They had learned to do that, to make themselves small, to avoid becoming part of whatever was happening. She didn't blame them. She wouldn't have looked either. Her heart beat fast and uneven, pounding against the layers of fabric pressed tight against her chest. She wondered if he could hear it. She wondered if anyone could. The guard paused, just for a second. In that pause, her fear sharpened. Pauses are dangerous. They invite imagination. She filled the silence with every warning she had ever learned, every story passed quietly between women, every lesson taught without words. Do not draw attention. Do not react too quickly. Do not assume safety. She told herself to stay still, to wait, to endure. The cold crept back into her awareness then, faint but persistent, a reminder that time was passing whether she wanted it to or not. Her fingers twitched involuntarily. She forced them still. The guard's presence loomed larger the longer he remained there. This wasn't supposed to be complicated. He was a guard. She was a prisoner. Roles were clear. Boundaries were supposed to be clear. But standing there, with his breath visible in front of her and her coat still open, clarity felt distant. Everything felt suspended. The moment refused to resolve itself. She thought briefly of her name, of who she had been before this place, before uniforms and numbers and lines. The thought slipped away as quickly as it came. The present demanded all of her attention. This was the moment she believed something bad was about to happen, not because she knew it would, but because she couldn't see how it wouldn't. Her body stayed locked, waiting, braced, ready for an outcome she did not want and could not escape. He didn't touch her hands, didn't touch her face. That was the first thing. In the space where fear had been building, where her body was braced for something else, his hands stopped short. They hovered, then redirected, careful, deliberate. He reached only for the fabric. 2 pieces of worn wool, stiff from cold, nothing more. He pulled the coat together, not roughly, not gently either, just enough. 1 button. It resisted at first, metal cold against colder fingers. He adjusted his grip slightly, working around the problem instead of forcing it. The motion was practiced, efficient, as if he had done this kind of thing before. Not often, but enough to know how quickly cold turns small tasks into clumsy ones. The button slid through the hole. The wind pressed in immediately, trying to reclaim the space it had lost. The coat closed against it, sealing the gap. Her breath came easier without her noticing it had been difficult. He didn't pause. He didn't look up to check her face, didn't wait for acknowledgement. His hands moved down. The second button was easier. Already aligned, already waiting. He fastened it quickly. 2 small movements, measured, complete.
The wind lost its edge. She felt the change before she understood it, the way the cold no longer cut directly across her chest, the way warmth, what little there was, stayed where it belonged. And then it was over. He stepped back immediately. Not one step, two.
Enough to restore distance. Enough to make the space between them unmistakable. He straightened, already turning away. No lingering, no explanation, no look exchanged. The moment didn't stretch this time. It ended. Did you notice what he did next? Or, more importantly, what he didn't do? He didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't say a word that could be misunderstood. He didn't wait for gratitude, didn't stand there to see her reaction. He simply returned to his place in line, hands back in his pockets, shoulders turned toward the wind again, as if nothing had happened, as if it had been the most ordinary thing in the world. Her body didn't respond right away. It stayed locked, still expecting something else to follow, still waiting for a consequence. But nothing came. No command, no correction. The line remained intact. The women around her stayed facing forward. No one spoke. The air settled back into its earlier rhythm. Wind, breath, silence. Only now, the space around her felt different. She became aware of her coat again. Closed, secure. The cold was still there. It hadn't softened, but it was no longer rushing in unchecked. Understanding arrived slowly. Not as relief, not immediately. First came confusion. She replayed the last few seconds in her mind, checking them for meaning, looking for the moment she might have misread. He hadn't said anything, hadn't signaled intent. He had simply done it, and then stepped away. Her shoulders lowered slightly without her noticing, just enough to ease the tension she'd been holding. The guard didn't look back. He didn't need to. The power of the moment wasn't in what he had done. It was in how quickly he had removed himself from it, in how carefully he had returned things to where they were before. Order restored, boundaries intact. She realized then that the danger she had felt hadn't been real. The fear had been hers. Understandable. Human. But mistaken. The coat held firm against the wind. The buttons stayed closed. She stood there, breathing, the cold once again the most pressing concern. No one commented, no one laughed, no one reacted. The moment passed through the line like a shadow, noticed by some, missed by others, but leaving no visible trace. And yet, it had changed everything for her. Not in a dramatic way, not all at once, but enough. Enough to unsettle the assumptions she'd been carrying quietly since her capture. Enough to introduce a doubt where certainty had lived. She had expected something else, something worse. What she had received was restraint. Not kindness announced, not generosity displayed, just a small correction, a problem solved, a step back taken immediately afterward. The simplicity of it was what made it difficult to process. There was no story to attach to it, no clear category. It didn't fit into the warnings she had learned to trust. He had done what was necessary, nothing more. The wind surged again, rattling coats along the line. She felt it on her face, sharp and unforgiving, but not on her chest. She stayed still, the same as before. But now, the stillness came from a different place. Her body began to release what it had been holding. Not all at once, just a fraction. Enough to let air move more freely in and out of her lungs. The guard stood a short distance away, profile turned toward the horizon. Just another figure in the cold. There was no acknowledgement between them. None was required. What had happened didn't need to be named. It didn't need to be remembered by anyone else. It existed only in the brief overlap between fear and clarity, between what she thought was about to happen and what actually did. No words, no look, just space. And in that space, something shifted. It took her a moment to understand. At first, she didn't move. She stayed exactly as she was, standing in line, coat closed now, buttons holding. The wind kept coming. It pushed against her shoulders, slid along her sleeves, rattled the loose ends of scarves and fabric around her. Nothing about the morning had softened, nothing had changed in the weather, and yet something inside her had. She noticed it slowly. The cold was still sharp, still demanding, but she was no longer shaking. Her body had been trembling before, small, constant movements she hadn't been aware of. Now those movements stopped. Not because she was warmer, but because something else had let go. She breathed in, then out. The breath came easier than it had moments before. She stayed where she was, eyes forward, the same as everyone else. No one was watching her now, if anyone ever had been. The guard had already stepped back into place. He was just another figure in a line of figures, shoulders turned into the wind, posture neutral. Nothing about him suggested the moment they had just shared. That was when it began to sink in. He hadn't taken anything. Not her time, not her attention, not her dignity. He hadn't asked for a reaction, hadn't waited for thanks, hadn't even looked to see how she would respond. There had been no exchange, no balance to settle. The realization felt unfamiliar. She searched for the cost, because there was always a cost. That was how she had learned to measure situations, what would be demanded later, what would be remembered, what would be used against her. But there was nothing. No expectation hanging in the air, no unspoken condition. The moment had ended cleanly, too cleanly. Her mind returned to the seconds before it happened. The fear, the certainty that something bad was coming. She felt it again, briefly, like a ghost of sensation passing through her chest. And then she saw it for what it was. An assumption. One she had made without thinking. One that had kept her tense, braced, prepared for harm. She felt something else then. Not relief, embarrassment. It crept in quietly, warming her face despite the cold. She had been wrong. Not about the danger of the world, that lesson had been earned too many times to forget. But about this moment. About him. She had filled the silence with fear because fear was familiar. It had protected her before. It had kept her cautious, alert. But here, it had led her astray. Her shoulders sagged slightly, the tension draining out in increments too small for anyone else to notice. She became aware of her hands again. They still felt clumsy, slow to respond, but they were no longer frozen in place. Her fingers curled inward, then relaxed. The line remained quiet. Someone nearby coughed, short and controlled. Another shifted weight from one foot to the other. Ordinary sounds returned, grounding her. She realized then that her heart was no longer racing. The frantic pounding had eased into something steadier. Her body was catching up to the truth. That nothing had been taken from her. That nothing was owed. The simplicity of it struck her harder than the fear had. She had prepared herself for consequences that never came. She had braced for humiliation that existed only in her mind. And now she stood there, coat buttoned, breathing, still whole. The contrast was too sharp. Emotion welled up before she could name it. It rose quickly, catching her off guard. Her throat tightened. She swallowed, trying to push it back down. This was not the place for it, not the time. She blinked once, then again. The tears came anyway. Not in a rush, not dramatically. They gathered quietly, blurring the edge of her vision. She didn't sob, didn't make a sound. She simply stood there as tears slipped free, cutting warm paths across skin already stinging from cold. She kept her head forward. She didn't wipe them away. Her hands wouldn't have managed it properly anyway. The tears weren't for the cold, or the camp, or the war. They were for the realization she hadn't expected. That kindness could arrive without warning, and leave without claiming anything in return. When was the last time kindness came without asking for anything? She couldn't remember, not clearly. She had grown used to exchanges, to calculations. Every interaction measured, every gesture weighed. This moment refused to be measured. It didn't fit into the categories she knew how to navigate. That unsettled her more than fear ever had. Fear had rules. This didn't. She felt a heaviness in her chest, followed by a strange lightness, as if something she had been carrying for a long time had loosened its grip, not released, just loosened, enough to breathe. She became aware of how tired she was, not from standing, not from the cold, but from always expecting harm, the effort of readiness, the constant vigilance. For a few seconds, she let that effort go, just a little. The wind pressed against her again, strong and unyielding. The world hadn't changed. The camp was still a camp. She was still a prisoner. Nothing about her situation had improved in any practical way. And yet, something inside her had shifted. A belief she hadn't realized she held had cracked. The idea that power always needed to assert itself, that proximity always came with threat. She had been wrong. Not foolishly, not naively, just wrong. The realization stung. It came with shame, not the kind imposed by others, but the quiet kind that follows understanding. She felt exposed by it, even though no one around her knew what was happening inside her. She had judged the moment before it finished unfolding. She had filled in the ending before it arrived, and the ending had proven her assumptions false. Her tears slowed. She sniffed once, subtle, controlled. No one turned. No one noticed. Or if they did, they didn't react. That, too, mattered. The guard didn't look over, didn't check on her. He had already moved on. That was part of it. Kindness that doesn't linger, that doesn't seek confirmation. It leaves you alone with it. She stood there, letting the last of the tears dry against her skin. The cold reclaimed its place as the most immediate concern. She adjusted her stance slightly, testing the buttons again with numb fingers. They held. She breathed in, then out. Her body felt lighter than it had moments before. Not safe, but steadier. She knew she would think about this later, turn it over in her mind when the day quieted again. But for now, all she knew was this. She had expected something bad to happen, and it hadn't. She cried quietly, because she had been wrong. The line didn't move. No one commented. That was how it continued. The wind came again, steady and indifferent. Snow lifted off the ground in thin sheets, then settled back down as if nothing had disturbed it. The American guard had already returned to his place, hands in his pockets, weight shifted slightly from one foot to the other. He didn't look toward her, didn't check to see if she was all right, didn't wait for anything. He stood the same way he had before, as if the last few minutes had never happened. Around them, the camp resumed its quiet rhythm, a cough here, a boot scraping ice there. Someone farther down the line adjusted a scarf. Another woman tucked her chin deeper into her collar. Routine reclaimed the space quickly. That was how things survived here, by moving on. No one mentioned the coat. No one mentioned the guard stepping forward. No one acknowledged the pause that had settled briefly over the line. There was no apology offered, no explanation given, and no thanks. Nothing to mark the moment as different. For everyone else, it likely wasn't. It was a morning, a cold one. Another small discomfort layered onto many others. The camp had seen worse. The people in it had learned not to linger on details that didn't change outcomes. But for her, the silence was loud. It followed her inward, settling into places she didn't usually allow herself to examine. She stood there, coat buttoned now, and felt the cold return to its familiar position, sharp, demanding, unavoidable. But fear didn't return with it, not fully. She noticed the absence like one notices the quiet after a noise stops. Something that had been pressing against her from the inside was no longer there. In its place was a strange, uncertain calm. Not comfort, not safety, just space. She didn't look toward the guard, didn't want to risk catching his eye and reopening something that had already closed. She didn't look toward the women beside her either. This wasn't something that needed witnesses. It had happened in public, yes, but it wasn't meant to be shared. The line remained intact. Orders came, eventually. Quiet ones. The kind delivered without urgency. The day began the way it always did. Work details, movements, time divided into manageable pieces. She followed along automatically, her body performing tasks it knew well. Lift, carry, walk. She answered when spoken to, stopped when told. Outwardly, nothing had changed, but inside, the moment replayed itself, not obsessively, not dramatically, just there. She remembered the exact way his hands had stopped short, the way he had stepped back without hesitation, the way the space between them had been restored deliberately, almost carefully. Those details mattered more than the action itself, because they revealed intention without explanation. Restraint isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It leaves no mark. That made it easy to miss. That made it powerful. As the hours passed, the memory settled into her like something that had always belonged there. Not as a lesson, not as a revelation, but as a quiet contradiction to everything she had been bracing for. How do you unlearn fear when it has kept you alive for so long? She didn't know the answer. Fear had served her well. It had sharpened her instincts, kept her alert, kept her cautious. It had helped her survive capture, transport, arrival. Letting it go entirely would be foolish. She understood that. But the moment at the line had exposed something else. That fear, when left unchecked, could also lie. That it could fill silence with danger that wasn't there. She didn't resolve anything that day. There was no sudden shift in how she saw the camp. No sweeping change in how she viewed the men guarding it. This wasn't that kind of story. She simply carried the moment with her, quietly. It surfaced later, unexpectedly, when a guard stepped aside instead of forcing someone to hurry, when a rule was enforced without cruelty, when distance was kept even when it wasn't strictly necessary. Small things, easy to dismiss. But now she noticed them. Not because she trusted them, but because she recognized the pattern. Restraint, again and again. The absence of something she had expected. That absence had weight. The memory didn't make her softer. It didn't make her naive. If anything, it made her more precise, more careful about what she assumed. She still flinched at sudden movements, still watched hands, still measured space. Fear doesn't disappear because it's been proven wrong once. But it does change. It adjusts. That morning at Camp Ripley had given her that. Not reassurance, not comfort, just evidence. Evidence that not every close step meant harm, that not every silence concealed threat. The line had moved on. The camp had moved on. No record was made of what happened. No report filed. There was nothing to remember officially. But unofficially, quietly, personally, that moment stayed with her. Not as a story she would tell, but as something she would carry. She would remember this later. Not the cold, not the snow. Those details blurred together over time, folded into other mornings that looked and felt the same. Minnesota winters didn't distinguish themselves. They arrived, stayed, and left marks that were easy to forget once the body warmed again. What stayed was something else. She remembered the distance. Not the distance forced by rules or fences, but the one chosen deliberately. The space that had been restored when it could have been crossed again. The 2 steps back that mattered more than the steps forward. She remembered how quickly it had ended, how nothing lingered, how nothing followed. No words added, no meaning explained. Just restraint. Applied once, and then withdrawn. At the time, she hadn't known what to call it. Later, she still wouldn't use the word kindness. That felt too large, too polished. It hadn't felt generous. It hadn't felt symbolic. It had felt practical,
necessary, as if someone had simply seen a problem and solved it without turning it into something else. She remembered how that had unsettled her, how she had been prepared for consequences that never arrived, how her fear had been so certain, so convincing, and how wrong it had been. She didn't remember the guard's face clearly. That faded quickly. She remembered his hands stopping where they did. She remembered what they didn't touch. Those absences mattered. Over time, the memory changed shape. It stopped being about the coat, or the cold, or even the moment itself. It became something quieter, a reference point. When fear rose too quickly, she thought of that morning.
When assumptions filled in gaps before reality had a chance, she thought of the space he had left behind. She didn't tell the story to anyone. There was nothing to tell, really. No one had been hurt. No one had intervened. The camp continued. The war continued. Life moved on in small, relentless steps. But inside her, something had shifted permanently. She had learned that restraint could be intentional, that power didn't always need to prove itself, that control wasn't only about what you could do, but about what you chose not to. What kind of strength does it take to stop yourself when you could do more? She didn't answer that question outright. She carried it, let it sit, let it complicate things she had once believed were simple. The memory didn't make her trusting. It didn't make her forgiving. It made her precise. It reminded her that dignity could be protected quietly, without witnesses, without explanation. That it could survive even in places designed to strip it away. Years later, when details of the camp blurred into fragments, faces replaced by shadows, days replaced by impressions, that moment remained intact. Not vivid, not dramatic, just intact. A small correction made in silence. She understood then that not every moral lesson arrives with clarity. Some arrive as doubt, as hesitation, as the sudden realization that the world had not behaved the way you were prepared for it to. And that realization, once experienced, cannot be undone. She didn't think of it as mercy or forgiveness. She thought of it as control, exercised inward instead of outward. A line not crossed, a choice made quietly. Dignity, she learned, can be protected not by power, but by restraint.